tonight we're discussing the security situation in Libya following an attack at the French embassy in the capital, the first attack on a diplomatic compound in the capital since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. A reminder of who we have in the studio tonight. Francis Picard is the editorial manager of Arab Oil and Gas. There he is on the left. Also with us, Arnaud Castagnier, an analyst at Milestone Group. I've got Stephen Ikovic here in the studio with me as well. He's from the American University of Paris. He's a professor there. And in Beirut tonight, Anas El Gamati is from the Carnegie Endowment's Middle East Centre. Thank you once again to you all for being with us. And Stephen Ikovic, we were just talking in the break there, weren't we, about how this attack is worrying not only for the French and their security interests, but it's very damaging for Libya in the long term as well.
Well, when we have an incident like this, there are a lot of unknowns and uncertainties that surround it. So what can we say for sure? We can say that this does create, at least temporarily, an environment of insecurity. That's not good for business. It's not good for foreign aid. It's not good for cultural and social relations. So that's clearly negative. On the other hand, as we understand, this does not mobilize public sentiment against France or against the United States. In fact, it backfires on those who perpetrate this kind of terrorist act. When you mobilize the population, they've mobilized the population terrorists, but against themselves. It's like attacking Sufi mausoleums in the same way. It just goes against the local culture. So in that sense, it has a positive outcome because it reinforces a certain sentiment of distaste and disapproval of those terrorists who represent, that's something that's really foreign to the Libyan culture or the Tunisian culture or other cultures for that matter.
Anas El Gamati, do you go along with that?
By all means, I think that, jihadism by its very nature is it's like a fish that only swims in certain waters. It needs a certain kind of condition for that water in order to swim, and those conditions are simple. Political marginalization, infringements upon freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, and those very things are being celebrated by the overwhelming majority of the Libyan populace and all those other countries that are coming into the Arab Spring. So I think AQIM is actually undergoing its most pertinent existential threat ever, and by that nature, I mean, if things continue and that we have stable moves forward in the political process, in the democratic process, then effectively it will die out. I mean, that's really what I believe, and I think, as was already said, it's really not going to mobilise popular dissent or anger against the French. That's by no means what's going to happen. I think the Libyans themselves came out of this revolution thinking we're now part of a global conversation. We all found our voice, and we can all come forward and be able to come a little bit closer to Europe. And that's a great sentiment. I think if we at this stage, if we don't capitalise on that, then we lose. We lose it. It's an incredible opportunity.
But why then, if there is such a desire in Libya to move away from this kind of extremism and this kind of atmosphere, why then is it becoming so difficult to create those institutions? The army is very weak, for example. The courts, the judiciary, the police. I mean, why is there not more trust in the public institutions?
Well, I think there are two main issues. I think the state by its very nature needs to have a monopoly on these institutions. They can't be looked at as favoritism. And unfortunately, so far, the cosmetic kind of landscape and the composition rather of the state and its institutions are made up by various militias from various regions around the country that have just had favoritism through the GNC or through the NTC and have found loyalty through that. And that's one of the biggest challenges. The other real kind of existential challenge is that if you look down on the landscape of Libya, you find that police bases, intelligence offices, and army barracks are literally overrun by militias, and that it's been a real challenge to try and get them out. I mean, if you can't actually, if 60% of your budget this year of 60 billion is being spent on salaries, on subsidies, then it tells you that, in fact, you're not rebuilding these very institutions, you're not building trust in these institutions. And in fact, there's also the other point, which is that the militias, the army and the police force were, distrusted during the last 40 years. And so there is, people that literally, again, went home. There are now 20 to 40% of absenteeism in the police forces in Libya. There is no consensus amongst the new establishment and the former regime. And unless you have a new narrative which can build around that, which can make them move forward, then I think you're going to struggle. I think that's really where the trust kind of lies, in being able to have some kind of inclusive dialogue which can bring people forward onto a national project, which will build these institutions up and allow, security and stability to prevail.
And we should add that one of the biggest challenges today for Libya is to build a state. Unlike Tunisia, which has a history of a state and the presence of a state, Libya doesn't have that, particularly after the fall of Gaddafi. So we can say that the Libyans are almost starting from zero, and that's another challenge that makes their movement toward
going from scratch.
practically starting from scratch. So that's a challenge. Maybe it could be an advantage in some ways. But the Libyans almost have to start from zero, and that's not going to be easy. And that leaves a kind of vacuum, which can be more easily exploited in Libya than in other places. So.
Arnaud Castagnet, it seems this could go one of two ways. And when you've got these kind of attacks, it'll either galvanise the Libyan people to really stand up to jihadism and root them out of the communities, as we saw in the wake of the Benghazi attack, or on the other hand, it could deter investment, it could deter foreign business, and that could leave Libya in a very different place.
Yeah, security issues are preventing Libya from being on the path of recovery, even if, despite those issues, oil production, for instance, is very similar to the pre-war figures. So I think what is pretty important is also that there's a big gap of perception of the authority of the state between Tripoli and the rest of the country. The government has the authority on Tripoli, but not on most of the other cities and states.
In Benghazi, for example, where foreign diplomats have decided to leave the city well alone, haven't they?
Yeah, exactly. But even Muammar Gaddafi built some of his authority on tribalism and on consensus and partnerships with other tribes. So there's no tradition of important institutions, and it's a national spirit, and that we need that the Libyan government needs to build, and it's extremely complicated, of course, for such a country.
That's a big obstacle for Libya, and it's a big obstacle for foreign investment getting in, isn't it? This lack of a centralised state.
Clearly. Of course, the fact that many people in Libya do not trust the state institutions after 42 years of Gaddafi regime is not surprising, but it's a key issue, as was said here, in social, political, economic and energy terms, and in foreign investment. As far as the oil and gas sector is concerned, which is of course a key sector in Libya's economy, the government set up petroleum facilities guard in order to protect oil facilities. So it numbers about 15,000 people coming from different rebel groups. And the problem is that there is much infighting between these groups. And so this force, which was set up in order to solve security issues, is sometimes creating security issues. So even in this key sector, it's very difficult for the state to affirm or reaffirm its authority, and the fact that it is able to set up institutions, including an army and a police, which is a national army and national police, and not an addition of different groups with different agendas, including in this key sector. So when you are a foreign investor, you will certainly think twice before investing in Libya, even if the oil and gas potential of Libya is very important, and many major oil companies did return to Libya, and we learned 2 days ago that Total is increasing its exploration investment in Libya, but in this case it's offshore. So of course in terms of security, it's very different from a project which would be based onshore.
Anas, in Beirut, I'm just wondering if Libya could actually use this tribal culture to its advantage. I mean, when we look at the other Arab Spring countries, as they're told, such as Egypt and Tunisia, they have got more of a job in some ways, in that they have to root out those individuals who are still related to the old regime. They've got a lot more work to do. Perhaps starting from scratch could work in Libya's favour going forward.
I think it could. I think it's an incredible opportunity. I would say that, for nuance here, that 2/3 of the population live between Tripoli, Benghazi and Misrata. And those 2/3 are under the ages of 35. 2/3 of that population is under the age of 35. And so I think, they're massively urbanized populations. They're very well aware of what's happening around them. Mobile phone penetration is up 70%. internet again, internet penetration is probably north of 40%. So those people are there willing to talk as well, and learn about what's happening in the rest of the country and across the border as well, and across the shore. So I think starting from scratch with an incredible kind of, canvas to paint on is a really, really great opportunity. But I think, again, we mustn't forget that Libya is part of a global conversation. The war on, I wouldn't want to use the word or the term, rather the war on terror. That has some negative connotations towards it, but rather the kind of moves towards ousting extremism is again a global conversation. And it was also a conversation that we had in Europe 70 years ago with with anarchists who were also blowing up cafes, who also had long beards, who also had this kind of ideological motive to herald a new world through supreme acts of violence. These are all things that we've all already gone through. Maybe just a hangover in Libya, but I think there's an incredible opportunity. But that's one that we all have to kind of grasp onto. And I think going forward, if international relations or anything,
do you think that?
Please.
Sorry, do you think Europe is overblowing the threat from Al Qaeda in the Maghreb? From what you're saying, it sounds like you think that Al Qaeda in the Maghreb is not as big a threat as people are making out.
Well, I think it sounds more like a brand, a corporate brand at that as well. So I think perhaps there are.
Well, they have their own Twitter page now.
They may do. I mean, this is a very interesting thing, like McDonald's, So I mean, it's a very interesting way of trying to, market themselves. And I think in that respect, they're an unequivocally modern kind of entity as well. And I think trying to brand it as such, I think there are definite sympathies across the world, across the North African Peninsula. But even if you go towards, the Middle East and the Levant, there are equally groups here in Beirut and in Syria as well that have sympathies when it looks at, the geopolitical kind of struggles that they're facing. One mustn't forget that there is a longer history of France and Britain and America of having, kind of very, very different approaches to the Middle East. And I think now committing yourself to a higher cause, to a different way of diplomacy is probably the way forward. I wouldn't say it's overblowing it, but I would say it's looking at it in a more sober light and looking at the ways in which international relations can be predicated on more equitable grounds, working alongside governments, not doing kind of shrewd counterterrorism operations, which actually, marginalise the populace at large and in fact created most of these issues. So I think you've got to try and commit yourself to a higher moral diplomatic engagement.
What do you make of that, Stephen?
Honestly, one of the goals of a terrorist act like this is to provoke precisely the kind of discussion we're having here today on the air. So in that sense, it's a success also, because we're talking a lot about it. And that's part of the discussion, part of the international discussion, because Franz Vanquette goes all over the world. And not only Franz Vanquette is talking about this today, but everybody else. So in that sense, once again, we should probably remind everybody that one of the goals of a terrorist act like this is exactly to provoke the kind of discussion we're having on the air right now.
But we are. It appears coming to a kind of consensus that good things can come out of this. That Libya is at least on the right path. Indeed,
and I think that there is a sense. I don't know Libya. I go to Tunisia a lot, and then from the point of view of those I know in Tunisia, there is a certain sense that Libya can make it, that there's certain optimism. Of course, Libya does not have the same long history of a strong and vibrant civil society that Tunisia has, but the Libyans evidently have started to build that civil society, and we wish them the best of luck in doing that.
Libya has a lot of oil as well, doesn't it? Which can't hurt going forward. I mean, there was a time during the Arab uprisings, people were saying that Libya could be the Dubai of North Africa.
Could be a curse too, all of that.
It could be a curse, could be a blessing. What do you think?
We say in French that comparison is no reason, but perhaps not Dubai would not be the best example for Libya. Of course, it's very different. Dubai was forced to diversify its economy because its oil reserves were becoming to disappear. Libya has, of course, a great future for many years and decades, in fact, in oil and gas. But as always in such countries, in economic and energy terms, the challenge is about the good governance in order to manage the oil and gas rent, the distribution of the oil and gas rent in order to build social peace within the country, and to use also the proceeds, parts of the proceeds of this rent to build a strong economy. And a strong economy is a diversified economy. So in this case, Dubai is an interesting case in point. But it's clearly governance and security are key issues. But Libya has stronger sets, and I would remain rather optimistic in the medium to long term, perspective. But we know very well that for Libya and for other Arab countries, after or during the Arab Spring or Springs, the transition is the most difficult path, of course. We know we come from a very difficult situation with 42 years of Gaddafi regime. We know what Libya could be in some years, several years, but the path between the two is very difficult to progress.
Just briefly, Arnaud.
Yeah, I would be very optimistic as well, because Libya has a very important economic potential, but there's a real issue of security in the borders between Libya and Tunisia, for instance. For instance, whereas there was the attack in Amenas, we then knew that the group of Mokhtar Belmokhtar could go through the Libyan border, and we know that there are also links between Ansar al-Sharia in Libya and other Salafist groups in Tunisia. So even if Libya is on the path to recovery, to economic recovery, in parallel there's still this very important issue of terrorism in the region, and the fact that neither Libya nor Mali nor even Algeria are able for the moment to really secure their own borders.
There's some work to do on tightening up those borders that we're just looking at right there. All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Arnaud Castagnier, Francis Perrin, Stephen Ikovic, and in Beirut tonight, Anas El-Gomati. Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks to you for watching. That's it for tonight's debate. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. This is France 24.